I did not know that a human hand could sound so much like a door closing until Lucy's palm struck the side of my face and sent me sideways into the edge of the kitchen counter. It was not the pain that stunned me first, though the pain came fast and hot, spreading from my cheekbone to my ear in a pulsing red wave that made my left eye water before I could stop it. It was the silence after it. The little apartment seemed to inhale and hold itself still. The refrigerator hummed. The cheap wall clock above the stove clicked once. Somewhere upstairs, the neighbor dragged something heavy across the floor. A chair or a crate, or maybe just another piece of furniture being moved in the endless nocturnal war that had become the soundtrack of my exile. Lucy stood 3 feet away from me with her hand still raised, fingers slightly curled, her diamond bracelet flashing beneath the dull kitchen light, and for one exposed second the mask slipped completely off her face. She did not look sorry. She looked inconvenienced by what she had revealed. Then she lowered her hand, smoothed the front of her cream-colored coat, and said in a voice so quiet it frightened me more than the slap, "Go work, old parasite. Stop standing around like the world owes you something." I tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek, and I remember thinking with a strange and almost tender clarity that Margaret had been right about her from the very beginning. My wife had seen Lucy before the rest of us did. Not her hair, not her smile, not her perfect polite laugh, but the thing behind her eyes that counted everything, priced everything, measured every room she entered by what might someday be extracted from it. I had spent 8 years hoping my son would see it too. 6 months after Margaret's funeral, standing in a rented apartment I secretly owned, with my daughter-in-law's handprint swelling across my face and my only child nowhere in sight, I finally understood that Leonard had seen enough to know and chosen not to look. That was the moment the father in me went quiet. Not dead, not healed, not finished grieving, just quiet in the way a house becomes quiet after the last family member leaves and the lights still burn for no one. My name is Henry Holloway. I am 63 years old, though for the last 6 months Lucy had spoken to me as if I were already a decaying object someone had forgotten to throw away. 6 months earlier, I had stood beside a polished mahogany coffin and watched the woman I loved for 42 years disappear beneath flowers, hymns, and the soft lies people tell at funerals, because the truth is too large to carry in public. Margaret had died on a wet February morning after a long illness that narrowed the world inch by inch until all that remained of our old life was a hospital bed, a plastic water cup, the pulse of machines, and her hand closing around mine whenever the pain allowed her to surface. She had been an accountant by training, a builder by instinct, and a reader of people with the terrifying accuracy of a woman who had spent decades watching clients lie to themselves before they lied to the IRS. She had built her firm from a one-room office above a dry cleaner into a company valuable enough to sell for more money than either of us knew how to spend. I had made my own fortune more quietly, first in industrial supply, then in real estate, then in investments that Margaret understood faster than the men pitching them to us. We never lived like millionaires. We lived like people who knew the difference between comfort and display. We kept the same house for 30 years, drove cars until they became old friends, and bought art only when it moved Margaret enough to stand in front of it without speaking. By the time she was diagnosed, our net worth was over $8 million. By the time she died, almost nobody knew that except James Morrison, our attorney, Sarah Chen, our real estate advisor, and a handful of accountants whose discretion had been purchased the honest way, with competence and long relationships. Leonard did not know. That was partly his fault and partly ours. We had not hidden our wealth from him when he was a boy, not exactly, because children understand warmth before numbers, and Leonard had grown up in a home where the lights stayed on, the pantry stayed full, vacations happened, tuition was paid, and nobody ever told him that dental surgery meant Christmas would be smaller. We taught him work mattered, generosity mattered, gratitude mattered, and for many years I believed he absorbed those lessons deeply. He used to help Margaret carry groceries from the car without being asked. He wrote thank you notes in crooked handwriting after birthday parties. When he was 11, he found $20 in a parking lot and insisted we turn it in at the store counter, then worried for 2 days that the person who lost it might have needed it for dinner. That boy existed. I cannot pretend he did not. The tragedy is that decent children do not always become decent adults. Sometimes they become frightened adults. Sometimes they marry the first person who makes fear feel like ambition. Sometimes they mistake domination for certainty, and slowly begin to speak with someone else's contempt in their mouth. Lucy entered our lives 8 years before the slap. I remember the first dinner because Margaret had cooked pot roast, not because pot roast was elegant, but because it was Leonard's favorite, and she wanted the woman he brought home to understand that love in our house had always been practical, fragrant, and served with potatoes. Lucy arrived 20 minutes late in a silver dress that caught the dining room light like fish scales. She kissed Margaret on both cheeks, though we were not that sort of family, called me Henry within 10 minutes, though I had never invited it, and brought a bottle of wine expensive enough to look thoughtful but not thoughtful enough to match the meal. She asked questions with a graceful tilt of the head, the way interviewers do when they already know what answer they want. How long had we lived in the house? Was the artwork original? Had Margaret inherited the jewelry in the cabinet? Did Leonard ever talk about wanting a larger place someday? Every question arrived wrapped in charm. Every answer vanished behind her eyes and became arithmetic. After dessert, while Leonard showed Lucy photographs in the living room, Margaret stood beside me at the sink with her hands in the dishwater and whispered, "She is taking inventory." I remember drying a plate too slowly and saying, "Maybe she is just nervous." Margaret gave me that look she used when clients tried to deduct things they should not have deducted. "Henry," she said, "a nervous person asks about your family. A hungry person asks about your assets." We made our first mistake that night. We told ourselves observation was wiser than confrontation. Leonard was 30 then, old enough to choose, young enough to resent interference, and so transparently proud that this glittering woman had chosen him that I could not bring myself to dim his happiness. Margaret agreed, but not because she trusted Lucy. She agreed because she trusted time. If Lucy loved him, money would not matter. If money mattered, time would expose her. We began withdrawing signs of wealth in small ways. Margaret moved the antique jewelry into a secure vault. I replaced certain documents in the Home Office with harmless copies. James restructured accounts under trusts and holding companies whose names sounded boring enough to induce sleep. Sarah began shifting properties into layered entities. To Leonard, it looked like his parents were aging, simplifying, downsizing, becoming cautious. To Lucy, it looked like a fortune perhaps existed, but might be smaller and harder to reach than she had hoped. What we did not predict, because even suspicious parents still dream foolishly when it comes to their children, was that scarcity would not discourage Lucy. It would make her more patient. She did not run from the possibility that we were less wealthy than we appeared. She leaned into it and began building the role that would give her access either way. She became concerned. Concern was Lucy's masterpiece. It did not begin cruelly. It began with small helpful comments spoken when Leonard could hear them, and we could not object without seeming ungrateful. "Your parents are so independent, but your father looks tired lately. Your mother is brilliant, but finances get complicated at their age. Maybe you should help them organize things before something goes wrong." She said these things softly, with her hand on Leonard's arm, turning control into tenderness. She volunteered to accompany Margaret to appointments, then criticized the doctors afterward. She offered to review insurance papers, then asked why certain policies were structured so inefficiently. She suggested Leonard be added to one modest account for emergency access, and when we allowed it as part of our test, she treated it as evidence that we needed management. Over 2 years, our son began repeating her phrases as if he had discovered them himself. "Mom and Dad are proud people. They would never admit they are slipping. We need to make things easier for them. The house is too much for them. The accounts are too scattered. They do not understand how vulnerable they are." Every sentence sounded like protection until you followed where it led. It led to Leonard believing he was our caretaker. It led to Lucy believing we were either a future inheritance or a present liability. It led to Margaret and me sitting across from James Morrison one grey morning signing documents that ensured our real estate, investments, royalties and insurance structures would remain invisible until we chose otherwise. Margaret used to say that a test reveals the examiner too. At the time I thought she meant Lucy. Later I understood she meant us. We told ourselves we were studying character, but we were also delaying pain. Every time Leonard failed to defend us, we invented reasons. He was tired. He was pressured. Marriage was complicated. Lucy was insecure. We had been too guarded. We had hidden too much. Parents have an endless supply of excuses when they are trying not to admit their child is becoming cruel. Margaret saw more than I did, but even she could not entirely release the boy who once brought her tea when she had migraines. During her illness, Lucy's mask thinned. She did not rage in hospital rooms. She was too intelligent for that. She waited in hallways and spoke to Leonard near vending machines, just loud enough for me to hear fragments. Another specialist. Another bill. Your father is not thinking clearly. Your mother would not want to drain your future. She would emerge into the room with sympathetic eyes, arrange the blanket near Margaret's feet, and ask whether the nurses had explained the cost of the new medication. Margaret never answered those questions directly. She would look at Lucy with that faded, terrible calm of the dying and say, "Some things cost money, Lucy. Some things cost your soul." The night before Margaret died, Leonard came to the hospital alone. Lucy had a charity luncheon, though I never learned what charity required a woman to wear emerald earrings and post 6 photographs of herself holding champagne. Leonard sat on the far side of the bed and stared at his mother's hand as if it belonged to someone he used to know. Margaret was heavily medicated, but she woke when he whispered, "Mom," and for a moment the room filled with the old Leonard, the boy Leonard, the one grief had not yet learned how to hide. He cried then. He bent over her hand and said he was sorry, though he did not say for what. Margaret lifted her fingers weakly and touched his cheek. "Be kind," she whispered. "Not successful. Kind." He nodded too hard, like a child promising something he did not understand. When he left, Margaret watched the door for a long time. Then she turned to me and said, "If he chooses her cruelty after I am gone, do not spend the rest of your life paying for the illusion that we still have our son." I told her not to talk like that. She squeezed my hand with the last strength she had and repeated herself, "Promise me, Henry. Do not let them win by making you small." I promised because she needed to hear it. I did not yet know that keeping the promise would require burying not only my wife, but the version of my son I had protected inside myself for 35 years. After the funeral, Lucy performed grief with tasteful restraint. She wore black, accepted condolences, corrected the florist twice, and made sure photographs captured her standing close enough to Leonard to look devoted, but not so close that her dress wrinkled. At the reception, she told several relatives how exhausting the last year had been for all of us, though she had visited Margaret fewer times than the night nurse. Leonard stood beside her, hollow-eyed and obedient, thanking people in a voice that sounded borrowed. 3 days later, Lucy suggested I move into one of their investment apartments temporarily. She used the word temporarily as if it were a kindness. "The old house is too full of memories, Henry. You should not be alone there." Leonard agreed, not looking at me when he said it. I let them move me into the 800-square-foot unit with thin walls, weak heat, and a kitchen window facing a brick wall, because the test Margaret had designed was not finished. I had access to everything, but I did not use it. I let Lucy believe my accounts were diminished. I let Leonard collect rent through the management structure, not knowing every payment traveled through his hands and returned quietly to mine. I let them believe the old man had nowhere else to go. Grief made the acting easier because I truly did not care where I slept at first. Without Margaret, even our old bedroom had become a foreign country. The humiliations arrived as weather arrives in late autumn, first cool, then sharp, then constant. Lucy stopped knocking within the first month. She entered with clipped instructions and perfume too strong for the small rooms. She inspected the thermostat, the pantry, the bathroom towels. She told me paper towels were expensive and asked whether I really needed the good coffee. She claimed the water bill had risen because I showered too long, though I had begun taking shorter showers simply to avoid hearing her complain. Leonard visited less often, and when he did, he stood near the door instead of sitting down, checking his phone while Lucy spoke for them both. "Dad, you understand things are tight. Dad, Lucy is just trying to be practical. Dad, we all have to make sacrifices." The first time he said sacrifices, I looked around the apartment at the second-hand table, the sagging sofa, the single photograph of Margaret they had allowed me to carry without making me feel dramatic, and I asked him what sacrifice Lucy had made. His face tightened. He said I was being unfair. That became their favorite word for any truth that made them uncomfortable. Unfair. There were dinners at their house where I was invited and then treated as if my presence were a logistical problem. Lucy seated me near the kitchen doorway, explaining that it would be easier with my nay. She corrected my stories when I mentioned Margaret's firm, interrupting quickly with, "That was a long time ago, Henry. Nobody wants tax history over dinner." She laughed when I misunderstood an app on Leonard's phone and said, Technology moves fast when you stop participating in the world. Leonard smiled weakly at the table and looked away. Once, when a guest asked what I had done before retirement, Lucy answered for me. Henry had a small supply business ages ago, she said. Modest thing, but he worked hard. Modest thing. The company I built had been acquired by a regional distributor for 7 figures, and the proceeds had seeded half the real estate portfolio Lucy hoped to inherit. I said nothing. Silence had become my laboratory. Every insult went into it. Every avoidance from Leonard went into it. Every moment when decency could have appeared and did not went into it. The worst moments were private and small. Lucy had a talent for shrinking a person by degrees so subtle that an outsider might accuse him of being sensitive. She moved Margaret's photograph from the sideboard when I visited, because it made the living room feel sad. She told Leonard not to discuss old family vacations because it encouraged me to live in the past. She asked me to sign birthday cards for relatives in advance because my handwriting had become shaky, though it had not. She used the phrase "at your age" the way other people use punctuation. At your age, you should avoid driving at night. At your age, you should not handle paperwork alone. At your age, you should be grateful Leonard still checks on you. Each time, Leonard absorbed the framing and gave me a careful look, half pity and half impatience, as if my continued existence required meetings they had not budgeted for. I began to understand how old people disappear while still living. Not all at once. First, your opinions become stories. Then your stories become interruptions. Then your needs become expenses. Then your presence becomes something everyone manages. The Thursday morning of the slap began with bills deliberately arranged on my kitchen table. I had placed them there like props, because the final test needed a stage. I had no trouble paying them. I could have paid every utility bill in the building for the next decade before breakfast, but I wanted Lucy to see what she believed was desperation. She arrived at 9, heels clicking down the hallway, keys jangling in her hand, though I had never given her permission to keep a set. She did not greet me. She pushed the door open, looked at the bills, and smiled with one side of her mouth, as if the sight confirmed something pleasant. "Henry, we need to talk." I looked up from my coffee and said good morning to you too. She ignored that. "Leonard and I have been reviewing the costs associated with your unit." Associated with my unit? She spoke as if presenting quarterly losses. Water is up. Electricity is up. Maintenance costs are up. You leave lights on. You keep the heat too high. You use the washer for small loads. She scrolled through her phone while speaking, each accusation supported by numbers she either misunderstood or invented. I let her continue until she reached the conclusion she had rehearsed. "Starting next month, you will pay $500 in rent plus your share of utilities." I asked calmly whether Leonard agreed. She smiled then, not kindly. "Leonard trusts me to handle the practical side of things." I should have hated her most in that moment, but what pierced me was Leonard's absence. It was always his absence. He did not need to be in the room to fail me. His silence had become Lucy's power of attorney over our family. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had lifted him from a crib, taught him to ride a bicycle, written checks for his tuition, held Margaret's hand while she died, and I asked Lucy whether there might be flexibility until my next Social Security check arrived. Her eyes sharpened. Then slowly I asked for $50, not $500, not help with rent, $50 for groceries until the next check. It was the smallest possible request I could make, not because I needed it, but because Margaret had once said cruelty shows itself most clearly when the cost of kindness is low. Lucy's reaction was instant. Her face twisted, but not because of the amount, because the request reversed the fantasy she had built. In her mind, I existed to drain Leonard, to consume, to burden, to ask. But saying yes to $50 would require acknowledging I was human. She could not do that. She stepped forward and called me a useless old parasite. I said quietly, "It is just $50, Lucy." That was when she struck me. After she left, I stood in the open doorway for a while. A young mother from the unit across the hall had heard enough to know something happened, but not enough to know what to do. She stood holding a laundry basket, eyes wide, and whispered, "Mr. Holloway, are you okay?" I almost lied. Old habits. Then I saw Margaret in my mind, sitting in her hospital bed, telling me not to become small. "No," I said, "I am not okay." The young woman set down the basket, and helped me find my glasses under the edge of the cabinet. Her name was Ava. She had a little boy who used to wave at me from the stairwell. She asked if she should call the police. I said not yet. I went to the bathroom, photographed my face from 4 angles, then drove myself to urgent care using the license Leonard believed I no longer trusted myself to use. The doctor asked how it happened. I told him the truth. He documented the contusion, the small cut inside my cheek, the swelling along the jaw. He looked uncomfortable, the way professionals look when family violence appears wearing good perfume and expensive shoes. Before I left, he said softly, "Mr. Holloway, you do not have to go back somewhere you are unsafe." I thanked him and almost told him I owned 17 properties, 2 buildings, a shopping center, a villa in Tuscany, and the apartment where I was being treated like a stray dog. Instead, I folded the medical report and placed it inside my jacket pocket beside Margaret's ring. That evening, the apartment seemed different, not better, sharper. Every object had become evidence. The cheap lamp Lucy once criticized, the stack of bills, the chipped mug Margaret had used during our last Christmas together because she liked its weight. I sat in the chair near the window with an ice pack against my cheek and let memory assemble itself into a verdict. I remembered Leonard at 5, asleep against my chest during a thunderstorm. Leonard at 14, furious because I would not buy him a car he had not earned. Leonard at 22, hugging Margaret so hard at graduation that she laughed through tears. Leonard at 30, introducing Lucy with pride trembling in his voice. Leonard last month, watching Lucy call me irresponsible because I forgot to bring a receipt for groceries she had asked me to buy for their house, then saying nothing. A person's life does not turn in one dramatic scene. It turns through accumulation. The slap did not create the truth. It made it impossible to keep negotiating with it. I texted James Morrison first, "Need to accelerate our timeline. Can we meet tomorrow?" His response came in minutes. "Of course, Henry. Everything all right?" I looked at the photo of my swollen cheek, then at Margaret's picture on the side table. "Everything is perfect," I wrote. "It is time." Then I called Sarah Chen. Sarah had been Margaret's client before she became our advisor, and she had the calmest voice I had ever heard in high-stakes conversations. When I told her to move on the Maple Street property, she did not ask 3 useless questions. She asked one useful one. "How fast do you want them out?" 48 hours after closing, I said. She paused only once. "That is Leonard and Lucy's residence." "Yes." Another pause. Then her tone changed, hardening into the professional steel that had made her feared by developers twice her size. "I can have cash offers by tomorrow afternoon. Immediate possession will reduce the buyer pool, but not enough to matter." "Henry, what happened?" I told her Lucy failed the final test. Sarah understood immediately. "Margaret would have said there were no more extensions," she said. I closed my eyes. Margaret had said exactly that about several bad investments and 2 bad relatives. No more extensions. James's office occupied the 32nd floor of a building where glass, marble, and silence worked together to make ordinary visitors feel underdressed. I arrived in my worn cardigan and discount slacks because the costume still served a purpose, though James looked as if he wanted to burn it the moment he saw my face. He came around his desk without greeting me, took my chin gently in one hand, and turned my cheek toward the light. His jaw tightened. "Henry, tell me you documented this." I handed him the printed photos and medical report. He read everything without speaking, then placed the pages on his desk with the care of a man setting down ammunition. "We can seek a protective order. We can also file assault charges." I sat across from him and looked at the skyline beyond his window. "Maybe later. First, we finish what Margaret started." He studied me for several seconds, then nodded, not with approval exactly, but recognition. He had known Margaret long enough to know that some plans outlived the people who made them. For 2 hours, we reviewed the architecture of my real life, the one Leonard and Lucy had never been allowed to see. The primary residence on Maple Street, still titled entirely in my name, appraised at $1.2 million, with Sarah already fielding offers above asking because the neighborhood had become fashionable among young executives who wanted old trees and good schools. 17 additional properties in 3 states, including 2 apartment buildings, a small retail strip anchored by a pharmacy, 5 single-family rentals, and the little lake cabin Margaret pretended she disliked because the plumbing was ridiculous but secretly loved because mornings there smelled like pine and coffee. The stock portfolio stood at $3.4 million, diversified through instruments Leonard would not recognize and Lucy would pretend to understand. Margaret's consulting royalties continued to deposit nearly $200,000 a year. Business interests, some direct and some layered through partnerships, had grown quietly while my son explained budgeting to me as if I were a teenager with a gambling problem. Total current net worth, James said, adjusting his glasses though he did not need to. 8.7 million conservatively. I nodded. The number did not thrill me. Money after loss becomes strangely quiet. It matters because of what it can protect, not because it can warm a bed. Then came the part that made James almost smile despite himself. The apartment building, the one Leonard believed, generated $4,000 a month after expenses. The one he had bragged about managing. The one where I had been paying rent through a management company that reported to him in one direction and to me in another. I owned it entirely through a shell corporation Margaret had named Blue Kettle Holdings after the enamel kettle she used every morning. Leonard had been collecting what he thought was profit from his father's diminished life, never realizing the building belonged to the father. The actual income, after maintenance reserves, had been accumulating quietly in an account marked for renovations. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was too clean. James leaned back. Your wife had a wicked sense of structure. She had a wicked sense of justice, I said. He opened the will file next. Leonard's previous inheritance, substantial but conditional, was gone. The life insurance policy listing him as beneficiary had been cancelled. Disability and medical support policies had been redirected. The new will left him $1. Lucy received nothing. Charities chosen by Margaret received the rest. James asked whether I wanted any language softened. I thought of Lucy's hand crossing the air. No. We discussed the Tuscan villa near Montalcino. Margaret had found it 3 years earlier, while recovering from a round of treatment that briefly made everyone optimistic enough to be foolish. She had spent 3 evenings scrolling through photographs of the stone house, vineyards, olive groves, and terraced gardens, describing where she would plant lavender, where I would complain about Italian plumbing, where we would drink wine at sunset and pretend we had retired gracefully instead of escaping American medical bills and wily disappointment. We placed the deposit 2 weeks before she died because she insisted. I argued that we should wait. She told me waiting had become a luxury she no longer trusted. If I do not get there, Henry, she said, then you will go for both of us. I promised because dying women are allowed to command the living. Now James confirmed the purchase had completed. The staff retained, the residents prepared. Your relocation documents are in order. Your flight can be moved up. I want to leave Sunday night, I said. He looked at the bruise again. Good. The house sale moved with brutal efficiency. Sarah had 4 offers within 24 hours and selected a young couple whose financing was unnecessary because family money, unlike ours, had apparently announced itself early and loudly. They wanted the Maple Street house because of the school district, the mature maples, and the backyard where Leonard had once buried a time capsule containing a baseball card, a plastic dinosaur, and a letter to his future self saying he hoped he became a good man. I had forgotten that until the closing week, and remembering it nearly stopped me. That was the danger of memory. It does not respect verdicts. It brings evidence for both sides. I stood in the empty house one evening before closing, after Sarah let me in, and walked to the far corner of the yard where the old oak roots lifted the grass. I wondered whether the box was still there. I did not dig. Some things are better left buried, especially when the man who wrote the letter would no longer recognize the man living inside the house. Lucy and Leonard had gone away that weekend, according to Lucy's social media, to celebrate a milestone she described vaguely as building the future with my favorite visionary. The photographs showed them at restaurants, where wine cost more than monthly utilities in the apartment she wanted me to pay for. Leonard looked tired in the pictures, but he smiled when Lucy leaned into him. She wore a red dress, and the necklace Margaret had given Leonard to pass to his wife someday if he married a woman worthy of family heirlooms. I remember Margaret hesitating before handing him that necklace after the wedding, whispering to me later that generosity sometimes feels like putting a candle in a room with no oxygen. Lucy wore it in the restaurant photo with one hand at her throat, diamonds catching the light, caption beneath it, grateful for the life we are building. I stared at that caption a long time. Then I printed the final letter. The letter took 3 hours because cruelty would have been too easy and too small. I wanted clarity. I wanted every sentence to carry the weight of documentation, not rage. I wrote that the house had been sold. I wrote that they had 48 hours to vacate. I wrote that Margaret and I had watched them for 8 years, not as a game, but as a final attempt to determine whether the love we had poured into Leonard had survived the life he chose. I wrote that Lucy's performance had been thorough, that she had measured us from the first night, that her mistake was assuming patience meant weakness. I wrote that Leonard's greater failure was not ignorance of our money, but silence in the face of cruelty. I listed the net worth, the properties, the portfolios, the royalties, the building he thought he managed. I explained that the rent he collected from me moved through structures he did not understand and returned to my accounts. I informed him his inheritance had been reduced to $1, Lucy's to nothing, and the insurance policies cancelled. I included the assault documentation and promised legal action if they pursued contact, harassment, or challenge. I ended with one sentence Margaret might have found severe but fair. You had 8 years to prove that love mattered more than access, and you failed every year more completely than the last. Sunday morning was cold enough that my breath clouded when I stepped from the rental car outside the Maple Street house. The BMW sat in the driveway because they had returned late, probably too exhausted or too drunk to notice the courier packet already waiting in James's office, or the legal filings moving through systems they believed existed only for other people. I entered through the kitchen door with the key I had carried for 30 years. The house smelled faintly of Lucy's candles, something expensive and artificial meant to evoke cedar, though real cedar had grown outside the den window until Lucy ordered it cut down because the shade interfered with photograph. I placed the envelope on the kitchen island beside her designer coffee cups. For a while I simply stood there. The kitchen had once held Margaret singing off-key while chopping onions, Leonard doing homework at the table, birthday cakes, arguments over college applications, snow days, quiet Sunday breakfasts, 1,000 ordinary memories that did not deserve what the house had become. I walked room by room, not dramatically, not touching much, just letting each space confirm that I was leaving not a home, but a museum of a family that had ended before anyone admitted it. In Leonard's old bedroom, the air seemed trapped in another decade. Lucy had wanted to convert it into a home gym, but Leonard resisted, perhaps the last sentimental battle he ever won. His trophies remained on the shelf, dusty now. A framed certificate from 8th grade hung slightly crooked. I stood in front of it and remembered the night he received it for community service after organizing a coat drive. He had been so proud that people clapped for him because he helped someone. Where had that boy gone? Had Lucy killed him? Or had she only fed what adulthood had already weakened? I did not know, and the not knowing hurt because blame is easier when it stays clean. I left the key on the dresser beside a photograph of Leonard at 10, grinning with both front teeth too large for his face. I did not take the photograph. I had enough ghosts. My final stop in America was Margaret's grave. Forest Hills Cemetery lay under a low gray sky, oak branches bare and black against the clouds. I knelt beside her headstone despite my knee, and placed one hand against the carved letters of her name. For several minutes, I could not speak. Then I told her everything: the slap, James's face, Sarah's offer, the house closing, the letter on the kitchen island, the flight that would leave at 11. I told her I was afraid. That part surprised me, but graves have a way of making honesty less optional. I was afraid not of Leonard and Lucy, but of what would remain of me after I stopped being hurt by them. For years, the conflict had given shape to my days. Without it, there would be only grief, freedom, and the terrifying question of who I was without someone needing to diminish me. Margaret, if she had been there, would have told me that peace feels empty at first, because the body mistakes quiet for danger. I could almost hear her. I touched the chain beneath my shirt, where her wedding ring rested against my chest. I kept my promise, I whispered. I do not know if I kept it well, but I kept it. By the time Leonard read the letter, I was already past security. My phone began vibrating as I sat near the gate with my 2 suitcases and a passport that suddenly felt heavier than law. The first call came from Leonard at 7, 12 p.m., the second at 7:13, then Lucy, then Leonard again. Text messages arrived in bursts. What is this? Call me now. Dad, this cannot be real. Lucy says you forged something. The buyers are here. There are legal papers. Pick up. Please pick up. I did not answer. I watched families board other flights. Business travelers remove laptops, children fall asleep on backpacks. My entire old life was collapsing in a house 30 miles away, and the airport remained indifferent. That is one of the coldest truths adulthood teaches. Your catastrophe is rarely visible to strangers. The world continues selling coffee. It announces boarding groups. It asks whether anyone wants to upgrade seats. At 8:02, a voicemail from Lucy arrived, and despite myself I listened. Her voice shook with rage, not fear. "You senile bastard," she hissed. "You cannot do this to us. That is our house. We will sue you. We will prove you are incompetent. You are nothing without Leonard. Nothing." The message ended with a sharp click. I deleted it. 5 minutes later, Leonard left one. "Dad, please. I do not understand what is happening. If this is about Lucy, we can talk. Please do not get on that plane." I closed my eyes because that one hurt. If this is about Lucy. Even then, he put the truth outside himself. The plane lifted through darkness just before midnight. City lights spread below like scattered coins, then blurred beneath cloud cover. I sat by the window with Margaret's ring in my hand and felt neither victory nor peace. Revenge stories lie when they make consequence feel clean. In reality, consequence is heavy. It drags everything with it, including the parts you loved before they became evidence. Somewhere below, Leonard was discovering that the father he underestimated had never been poor, never been powerless, never been dependent on his mercy. Somewhere below, Lucy was realizing that 8 years of strategy had yielded homelessness, exposure, and a husband whose usefulness had expired. I wanted to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt cold. I drank the water the flight attendant gave me, declined dinner, and watched my reflection in the dark window until it looked like another old man flying beside me toward a country where nobody knew his failures. Florence met me with afternoon light the color of warm stone. The customs officer stamped my passport and said, "Welcome to Italy, Signor Holloway, business or pleasure." "Home," I said before thinking. The word surprised both of us. Maria Benedetti waited beyond arrivals, holding a small sign with my name written in careful block letters. She was in her early 50s, with dark hair pulled back, kind eyes, and hands that had worked too long to pretend softness was the same as gentleness. When I approached, she smiled as if she had been waiting not for an employer, but for someone returning from a war. "Signor Enrico, finally." She kissed both my cheeks. "Your wife wrote that you might look stern when you are overwhelmed." I laughed for the first time in days. "Margaret warned you about me." "Many times," Maria said, "always with love and sometimes with instructions." The drive to Montalcino wound through hills so beautiful they felt almost accusatory. Cypress trees stood like dark green flames along ridgelines. Vineyards curved with the land instead of conquering it. Stone houses appeared and disappeared behind olive groves. Maria talked constantly, because she seemed to understand that silence might swallow me if left unattended. She told me about the workers, the harvest schedule, the old cellar, the roof repairs, the neighbor who argued with goats, the village butcher who insisted Americans overcooked everything. Then, as the car turned onto a private road lined with lavender and olive trees, her voice softened. "Your wife loved this road. She wrote to me that when you saw it, you would pretend not to cry." I looked out the window quickly. "I am not crying." "Of course not," Maria said. "The wind here affects many eyes." The villa appeared around a bend, honey-colored stone beneath a terracotta roof. Green shutters opened to the late sun, grapevines climbing one wall as if the house itself had grown from the soil. Margaret had chosen this place while dying, and seeing it without her felt like receiving a gift after the giver had vanished. Maria let me stand in the courtyard as long as I needed. The air smelled of rosemary, dust, and something sweet from the fields. Bays moved through lavender. Somewhere inside, a pot clattered, and a woman called in Italian. The villa did not care about Lucy. It did not know Leonard. It had survived wars, harvest failures, births, deaths, marriages, droughts, and probably worse men than I had ever met. Its endurance humbled me. For the first time, I wondered whether Margaret had chosen it, not because it was beautiful, but because it could teach me how to remain standing without becoming hard. Maria showed me everything: the kitchen with copper pots and a stone hearth, the dining room where 12 could sit, though I knew only one chair would be mine for a while, the library filled with books in Italian, French, and English, the wine cellar cut into the hillside, cool and dim, its bottles resting in dust older than some countries. The bedroom opened onto a balcony overlooking the valley, and on the small table near the window sat a blue envelope addressed in Margaret's handwriting. My knees weakened. Maria stepped back without a word. I opened it slowly. Henry, if you are reading this there, then you kept going longer than you wanted to, and I am proud of you. Do not turn this house into a shrine for me. Plant the basil, drink the wine, let people cook for you. Be difficult about at least one thing, so they know you are alive. And if Leonard breaks your heart, remember that love is not measured by how much suffering you accept. Sometimes the last thing a father can teach is consequence. I sat on the edge of the bed and wept until the light changed on the floor. For the first weeks, Tuscany felt less like freedom than detox. My body did not know what to do without daily humiliation. I woke expecting a knock, a demand, a criticism about lights or bills or groceries. Instead, I woke to church bells, coffee, and Maria arguing with someone downstairs about tomatoes. Workers greeted me with respect that was neither exaggerated nor transactional. They called me Signor Enrico, asked whether I wanted to see the vines, brought me bread, corrected my Italian without cruelty. The first time a young worker named Paolo handed me pruning shears and showed me how to cut a vine properly, I almost refused because my hands had grown uncertain. He waited patiently, not with the impatience of youth toward age, but the simple expectation that I could learn. That nearly undid me. Being treated as capable after months of being treated as expired is not immediately comforting. It is disorienting. You discover how much of the insult you accidentally swallowed. Leonard and Lucy did not disappear. They became weather from across the ocean. Missed calls, emails, legal notices forwarded by James, threats, then pleas, then accusations dressed as concern. Their first attorney filed a challenge claiming diminished capacity, undue influence, and elder exploitation by advisors. James responded with medical evaluations, psychological assessments, recorded instructions, signed documents, financial histories, property records, and the urgent care report documenting Lucy's assault. The judge dismissed the emergency motions faster than even James expected. Their attorney withdrew 2 weeks later. A second attorney sent a letter suggesting mediation would preserve family dignity. James sent back one sentence Margaret would have applauded. Family dignity was available for 8 years, and your clients declined it. After that, the formal pressure faded. Informal desperation remained. Lucy called 3 months after I arrived. Maria brought the cordless phone to the garden, where I was kneeling among basil seedlings Margaret had dreamed of planting. Maria's mouth tightened as she said, "She claims she will keep calling until you answer." I took the phone because sometimes closing a door requires hearing the hand on the other side. Lucy's voice had changed. It had lost height, not humility exactly. Fear makes a fine imitation when pride runs out of oxygen. "Henry, thank God. We need to talk." I said, "No, we do not." She rushed ahead. "Leonard did not know. He did not know about the money, the properties, any of it. You cannot punish him for not knowing." I looked across the garden at the valley beyond, where workers moved between rows of vines in the afternoon light. "I am not punishing him for ignorance, Lucy. I am holding him accountable for silence." That sentence slowed her. Then she told me they were staying with her mother, that Leonard had lost his job because stress made him unreliable, that credit cards had been cancelled, that the BMW was gone, that her mother expected them to contribute to expenses. I almost smiled at the symmetry but did not. Cruelty, if enjoyed too much, begins to resemble the thing it condemns. Then came the real reason for the call. "What would it take, Henry? What would it take for you to forgive us?" The question sounded almost human until she added, "What about Leonard's inheritance?" There it was, the hook beneath the bait. I closed my eyes. "Lucy," I said, "you are still asking about money because you have mistaken loss of access for remorse." She began crying then, or performing crying, And after all those years, I still could not always tell the difference. People change, she said. Maybe, I answered, but I will not spend the rest of my life supervising your attempt. She called me selfish. She said Margaret would be ashamed. That was when the last warmth left my voice. Do not use my wife's name as a rope, I said. You spent years stepping over her memory to reach her money. You do not get to hide behind her now. I ended the call and handed the phone back to Maria, who gave me a glass of wine without comment. That evening, I blocked every number except James. The donations began as a legal strategy and became something else. The revised estate plan had already directed most assets toward charities Margaret cared about, but I wanted to act while alive. I gave $500,000 to pediatric cancer research in her name. I funded a family consultation room at the hospital, where she had endured too many frightened conversations under fluorescent light. I endowed accounting scholarships for young women from working-class families, because Margaret had once been told by a professor that numbers were a respectable hobby for a woman, but not a serious profession. I funded elder abuse legal clinics, because I had learned how easily humiliation hides inside family structures when money, age, and dependency become weapons. Each gift was documented. Each acknowledgement came to the villa, paper proof that Margaret's life continued moving outward instead of narrowing into the hands of people who had not honored her. Every dollar given away felt like removing furniture from a burning room before the wrong people could claim salvage. The grape harvest changed me more than the money did. Harvest does not care about your grief schedule. Grapes ripen when grapes ripen. Workers arrived before dawn with laughter, baskets, knives, thermoses, children still half asleep in sweaters. Maria insisted I join at least for the first morning. I told her I would slow everyone down. She said, good, then they will remember patience. The vines were damp with morning cold, leaves brushing my sleeves as Paolo showed me where to cut. My back hurt within an hour, my hands cramped by noon. I was clumsy and slow, and embarrassingly proud of every basket I filled. At lunch, we ate bread, cheese, olives, tomatoes, and slices of cured meat beneath a tree, while an old man named Gianni sang a song everyone pretended to hate, and then joined anyway. I thought of Lucy calling me a parasite. I looked at my stained hands, at grapes under my nails, at people who did not need me to be rich or poor in order to treat me as present, and felt something inside me begin to thaw painfully. 6 months after my arrival, Leonard's letter came through James. I recognized the handwriting before opening it, though it had grown tighter and less confident. Dad, I know you may never read this, but I need to write it without asking for anything. Lucy and I are divorcing. I am not telling you because I think that fixes what happened. It does not. I am telling you because I finally understand that I used her as an excuse for choices I made. I let her speak to you in ways I knew were wrong, because confronting her would have forced me to confront who I had become. I told myself you were difficult. I told myself you were proud. I told myself Mom's death made everything complicated. The truth is that I was a coward. I stood in rooms where you were humiliated and did nothing. I let my wife slap my father and still tried to make it about misunderstanding. I do not deserve forgiveness. I am not asking for money. I am writing because Mom told me to be kind, and I was not. I hope wherever you are somewhere beautiful. Leonard. I read it in the garden, because that was where I trusted myself least, to become either too hard or too sentimental. The first writing made me angry. The second made me tired. The third found the father still living somewhere beneath the verdict. I remembered Leonard at the hospital, crying into Margaret's hand. I remembered the boy with the lost $20. I remembered the man at the apartment door saying, Lucy is just trying to be practical. All of them were true. That is what makes family damage so difficult. Monsters are easy to exile. Sons are not. I did not call him. I did not write back directly. Instead, I instructed James to modify the will again. Leonard would receive $50,000, held in trust, and released only after completion of financial counseling, and no contact with Lucy for 2 years. Enough to begin again, not enough to erase consequence. James asked if I was sure. I looked at Margaret's basil at the valley at my hands. Justice without mercy becomes another kind of cruelty, I said. Mercy without consequence becomes permission. This is the only balance I can live with. Winter came softly to the villa. Frost silvered the vines at dawn. The olive oil pressed golden and sharp from fruit I had helped gather. Maria taught me to make ribollita badly, then less badly. I began taking Italian lessons from a widowed teacher in the village, who corrected my pronunciation with the severity of a judge and brought me lemon cake every Thursday. I still woke some nights thinking I heard Lucy's heels in the hallway. Trauma has its own clock, but the sound faded over time, replaced by rain on tile, wind in cypress trees, distant dogs, church bells. I spoke to Margaret often, not because I believed she hovered nearby arranging my happiness like furniture, though sometimes I hoped she did, but because love after death needs somewhere to go. Her photograph hung in the dining room, not like a shrine, but like a window. I placed fresh rosemary beneath it each Sunday. It was not healing exactly. Healing implies a wound closes. Some wounds become rooms you learn to walk through without turning on every light. A year after the slap, James sent me a final packet. The estate challenges were fully dismissed. The Maple Street buyers had moved in and planted a swing set in the backyard. The apartment building had been renovated, and Ava, the young mother who helped me find my glasses, now lived in a freshly repaired unit at below market rent under a tenant protection program I funded quietly. Leonard had begun working again, smaller job, honest job, no executive title. Lucy had tried to sue him for support and failed. She had moved in with a man whose money, according to Sarah, was less substantial than advertised. I felt no joy reading that, only a cold recognition that people who live by extraction eventually meet others doing the same. James included a note in his own handwriting. Margaret would say the board is finally balanced. I sat with that line for a long time. Balanced maybe. Restored no. Restoration was impossible. There are things a family cannot return from because the return would require pretending the wound did not teach you anything. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, I opened the last recording she had left. I had avoided it for a year because grief sometimes needs unopened doors. Her voice emerged through a little static, thinner than I remembered but unmistakably hers. "Henry, if you are listening on the day I think you are, then stop making that face." I laughed and cried at once because of course she knew. She continued, "I hope you are in the gardens. I hope you planted basil even if you complained. I hope Leonard found his way back to himself, but if he did not, I hope you did not follow him into darkness trying to carry him. We were good parents, not perfect. Good, that has to be enough." Then a pause. "Promise me one more thing. Do not let what they did become the last story of your life. Let it be the last story of that life. Then start another." The recording ended there. No swelling music, no miracle, just silence in a stone house built before my country existed. That evening I walked through the vineyard alone. The rows were bare and dark against the winter sky, vines twisted like old hands waiting for spring. I carried a glass of wine made from the harvest I had joined, and when I reached the hill above the villa, I looked down at the warm lights in the windows. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty did not undo the cost. My wife was still dead. My son was still a stranger trying, perhaps, to become less strange from far away. My old home belonged to people who would never know where Margaret kept the Christmas linens, or which stair creaked when Leonard sneaked down for water as a child. I had survived, but survival had not made me whole. It had made me precise. It had taught me that love without boundaries can become a slow form of self-abandonment, that family can be both sacred and unsafe, that money reveals character less by who wants it than by who changes when they think you have none. I raised the glass toward the first stars and did not toast victory. Victory was too clean a word for a man standing alone in a foreign vineyard, with his dead wife's ring against his heart. I toasted Margaret. I toasted the boy Leonard had been, and the man he might still become somewhere beyond my reach. I toasted Ava and her son in the renovated apartment. I toasted the hospital room bearing Margaret's name, the scholarship letters, the children who would never know that a cruel daughter-in-law's slap helped redirect money toward their futures. Then I drank, and the wine tasted of dark fruit, earth, weather, labor, and time. It tasted like something that had survived pressure and become sharper for it. Behind me, the villa lights glowed steadily. In front of me, the vineyard disappeared into darkness. I stood there until the cold entered my bones, then turned back toward the house alone, not healed, not triumphant, but no longer available to be diminished. That was the only ending life had offered me. It was not warm, it was not clean, but it was mine. In the months that followed, I learned that distance does not end a family conflict as much as it removes the audience. Leonard was no longer able to knock on my door. Lucy was no longer able to enter without permission. and yet both of them remained inside the small mechanical habits grief had carved into me. I still reached for my phone every morning before coffee, expecting to see another accusation disguised as concern. I still paused before buying anything for myself, not because I lacked money, but because I had spent too long letting Lucy's voice turn comfort into guilt. The first time I bought a handmade wool coat from a tailor in Siena, I stood in the shop for 20 minutes arguing with a dead version of my daughter-in-law in my own head. Too expensive, too indulgent. Who are you trying to impress at your age? The tailor, a narrow man with silver eyebrows and pins in his sleeve, watched me with professional tact until he finally said, "Signor Enrico, a coat is not a confession. It is only a coat." I bought it then, but when I returned to the villa and hung it beside the old cardigan I had worn through those last months in America, I felt shame first, then anger at the shame, then sadness that Margaret was not there to laugh at me for needing permission from an Italian tailor to stop freezing. That was how recovery happened, if recovery was even the word. Not as a sunrise, as small humiliating negotiations with habits left behind by people who had no right to enter your mind, and yet had lived there long enough to know where everything was kept. I began seeing a counselor in Florence, because Maria insisted in the gentle but immovable way she insisted on everything that mattered. His name was Dr. Bellini, though he told me to call him Tommaso after the third session, and he worked from a narrow office above a pharmacy that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old paper. The first time I sat across from him, I tried to explain the situation the way I had explained it to James, as a sequence of facts, dates, assets, legal structures, documents, decisions. He let me talk for nearly half an hour without interrupting. Then he folded his hands and asked, "Where did you feel it in your body when she slapped you?" I said, "My face, obviously." He did not smile. Later he asked, "And where do you feel it now?" I almost told him I did not feel it at all, that I had handled it, that the consequences had been delivered, that the estate was protected, that the abuser was gone, that the son had written an apology. Instead, I looked down at my hands and realized they were clenched around the arms of the chair so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. My body, it seemed, had not accepted the legal resolution as emotional proof. The body remembers being trapped even after doors open. Tommaso said that in our fifth session. He wrote it down on a small card and gave it to me. I kept the card in my wallet, tucked behind a photograph of Margaret and me from 1984, young and sunburned at a beach in Maine, smiling like two people who believed all future pain would be manageable because they had each other. One afternoon in late spring, a letter arrived from Lucy, not through James this time but directly to the villa, which meant she had found the address. Maria was furious. She stood in the foyer holding the envelope between two fingers, as if it contained something infectious. "This woman should not know where you sleep," she said. I agreed, but I still took the letter. Curiosity is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the old wound checking whether the knife has changed shape. Lucy's handwriting was dramatic, slanted, expensive looking, each letter pressed hard into the paper. She began with Henry, not Dad, not Mr. Holloway, not even the false sweetness of Dear Henry. She wrote that she had been misrepresented, that Leonard had always been unstable, that she had carried the emotional weight of the family for years, that Margaret had never liked her because older women often resent younger women who bring change. That sentence alone made me set the letter down and walk outside for 10 minutes. When I returned, I forced myself to read the rest, because avoiding poison does not mean pretending it was never mixed. Lucy claimed the slap had been provoked by my manipulative request for money, that I had been trying to make her look cruel, that I had engineered the family's collapse to punish her for seeing through me. She said Leonard had become useless, that divorce proceedings were humiliating, that everyone now treated her like a gold digger because I had created that narrative. Then near the end, the mask slipped in the familiar way. She wrote, "You had more than enough to help everyone, and instead you chose to hoard power until you could destroy us. People like you should not be allowed to decide who deserves security." I read that sentence several times because it contained Lucy's entire philosophy. Security was not something earned, built, shared, or honored. It was something she believed should attach itself to her because she wanted it, because she had arranged her life around proximity to other people's resources, because consequences felt to her like theft. I did not respond, but I did ask James how she had found the address. He investigated quietly and discovered that Lucy had contacted a former travel consultant by pretending to be an emergency medical proxy. She said I had suffered a cognitive episode abroad and the family needed to reach me. The consultant, frightened and careless, had confirmed the region but not the full address. Lucy had then searched property records through a private service and found the villa purchase. James sent a letter that could have frozen wine in the bottle. He reminded Lucy's attorney of the assault documentation, the dismissed incompetency claim, the harassment record, the false representation made to obtain private travel information, and the fact that Italian authorities take stalking of foreign residents seriously when supported by American legal filing. Lucy did not write again. Still, for weeks afterward, I checked the gate camera every evening. That is what people rarely understand about escaping controlling people. Even when they cannot reach you, they teach you to expect arrival. I began locking doors earlier. I asked Maria whether strangers had called. I looked for unfamiliar cars on the road. Tuscany remained beautiful, and I remained alert. Both were true. Leonard's changes reached me in fragments, mostly through James, occasionally through Sarah, once through a mutual cousin who did not realize she was carrying more emotional weight than gossip usually permits. Leonard had moved into a small apartment near his new job, not far from the industrial district where I had started my first warehouse. He no longer drove a luxury car. He had begun attending a support group for men recovering from abusive relationships, though I did not know whether he used the word abusive because he meant Lucy's treatment of him, or because it helped him avoid naming his treatment of me. He sold some of his expensive watches. He stopped drinking for a while. He visited Margaret's grave every Sunday for 6 consecutive weeks, then less often, then irregularly, which sounded about right. Human beings do not sustain symbolic gestures unless they become part of the soul. One day James forwarded a photograph Leonard had mailed to his office with no note. It showed fresh flowers at Margaret's grave, white lilies and blue irises, her favorites. In the corner of the photograph, just visible near the stone, was a small folded paper weighted with a pebble. I asked James if he knew what it said. He did not. I did not ask him to find out. Some apologies are not for the living. During the summer, the village invited me to a small festival that involved too much food, too much wine, and a saint whose history nobody explained clearly enough for me to follow. I went because Maria threatened to send half the village to carry me down if I refused. Children ran through the square with paper flags. Old women evaluated everyone from plastic chairs with the solemnity of border agents. Men argued about football weather and whether a certain sauce required more garlic than some fool had used last year. For a few hours, I forgot to be the man who had left his family behind. I became the American who owned the old vineyard and pronounced bruschetta wrong, until 3 grandmothers corrected him at once. A widow named Lucia, who sold honey and had a laugh that frightened pigeons, asked me to dance. I declined. She asked again, louder, in front of witnesses. I danced badly. People clapped anyway. That night, walking back to the villa beneath strings of yellow lights, I felt a kind of happiness so unfamiliar that I mistrusted it. It was not the old happiness of being with Margaret. It was thinner, more fragile, less rooted, but still real. Then guilt came immediately afterward, because happiness without Margaret felt like betrayal. Tommaso later told me grief often treats new joy like an intruder. I told him grief could mind its own business. He wrote that down and said it was progress. The coldness of the ending did not arrive as drama. It arrived one morning in September when James called at an hour early enough to mean he had forgotten the time difference or the news mattered. I was in the kitchen slicing bread, while Maria scolded the coffee machine. James said Henry Leonard was in an accident. The knife stopped in my hand. For one suspended second, every consequence I had chosen dissolved, and I was only a father hearing danger near his child's name. He is alive, James added quickly. Minor injuries, a broken wrist, concussion, bruising. He was driving back from Margaret's cemetery in heavy rain. No one else was hurt. I sat down slowly. Maria took the knife from my hand without asking. James continued. He asked the hospital to contact me because he did not want to violate your no-contact instructions. That pierced me in a place I had armored badly. Even injured, he was obeying the boundary, or performing obedience, or both. Human motives are rarely pure enough to comfort anyone. James said Leonard had insurance now, modest but sufficient. He did not need money. He had only asked whether I could be told. I said thank you and hung up. Then I walked to the terrace and stayed there until the coffee went cold. All day I wrestled with the old reflex. Call him, fly back, send money, repair what fear had exposed. A father's body is trained for emergencies long after the child becomes a man. I pictured Leonard in a hospital bed, wrist wrapped, forehead bruised, looking younger because pain makes adults briefly resemble their childhood selves. I pictured Margaret asking whether I had called. I pictured Lucy mocking the softness from somewhere beyond relevance. By evening, I wrote a letter. It was short because anything longer would become a bridge. I was not ready to rebuild. Leonard, James told me about the accident. I am glad you are alive. I hope you heal fully. Take care of yourself. Henry. I stared at the signature for a long time. Not Dad. Henry. The omission was not punishment exactly. It was honesty. I had been his father all his life, but fatherhood had become a room neither of us knew how to enter without stepping on broken glass. I mailed the letter through James. Leonard replied 2 weeks later with 3 sentences. Thank you for writing. I understand the signature. I am still sorry. I placed that letter in the wooden box too. Not with Margaret's letters, but beneath them, separated by a ribbon. Even paper needs boundaries. The villa changed with seasons. In autumn, the vines burned gold and rust before going bare. In winter, fog settled in the valley like breath held between hills. In spring, the garden Margaret had dreamed of erupted with basil, tomatoes, lavender, rosemary, and stubborn little flowers Maria insisted had chosen their own locations. I learned enough Italian to argue badly at the market. I learned which worker's daughter wanted to study engineering and quietly funded her exam preparation through a local foundation so she would never need to thank me. I learned that olive oil could taste green, that wine changed mood after breathing, that loneliness at sunset was sharper than loneliness at noon, and that a person can be grateful for a life while still grieving the one that made gratitude necessary. I did not become a wise old man in a postcard landscape. That would be another lie. I became a man with money, land, scars, routines, and a dead wife's voice in his head telling him to stop apologizing for surviving. 2 years after leaving America, I returned once secretly, because Margaret's headstone needed repair after a winter storm damaged the base. I told no one except James. I flew into New York under gray skies, stayed in a hotel near the airport, and drove to Forest Hills Cemetery before dawn. America felt louder than I remembered, even in the quiet. Wider roads, harsher lights, coffee too large, strangers moving as if chased by invisible debts. At the cemetery, the groundskeeper showed me the damage, and I approved the restoration. Then I stood beside Margaret's grave with my hands in the pockets of the wool coat from Siena. Someone had left flowers there recently, not lilies, blue irises, and a small bunch of grocery store daisies. Leonard, I knew without proof. Near the flowers sat a sealed envelope with my name on it. I picked it up and almost put it back. Then I opened it. Dad, it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment. I come here because it is the only place I can talk to both of you without asking you to answer. I know James may tell you I am doing better, but better is not the same as forgiven. I am learning that. Lucy used me, but I let her because being chosen by her made me feel important. I thought Mom and you were old, cautious, embarrassing, stuck in the past. I confused softness with weakness and money with proof. I am writing this here because if you never read it, maybe Mom will. I am trying to become someone who would have defended you that morning. I know becoming him later does not undo that I was not him then. I am sorry, Leonard. The letter ended there. No request, no address, no manipulation I could detect, though suspicion had become one of my permanent senses. I folded it and placed it in my coat pocket. For a long time, I stood there listening to wind move through bare branches. Then I said aloud, I do not know what to do with him, Margaret. The cemetery gave no answer. Cemeteries rarely do. They only hold the question steady until you stop expecting the dead to solve the living. I did not see Leonard on that trip. I could have. James knew how to reach him. I even drove once past the street where his apartment building stood, a brick structure with old fire escapes and a small grocery on the corner. A light was on in a third-floor window. I did not know if it was his. I parked across the street for 7 minutes, hands on the wheel, feeling ridiculous, cruel, tender, frightened, old. Then I drove away. Some readers of a life would call that failure. Perhaps it was, but I had learned that reconciliation demanded more than remorse from the offender. It demanded a capacity in the wounded person that may or may not remain. Leonard was trying to become better. I believed that. I also believed that the part of me capable of being his father in the old way had been exhausted before it could be repaired. Love can survive where trust cannot. That is one of the coldest arrangements the heart can make. When I returned to Tuscany, Maria did not ask whether I saw him. She only looked at me once and set another plate at dinner, though no one sat there. That was her way of acknowledging absence without forcing confession. We ate soup with beans and black cabbage while rain struck the windows. Afterward, I took Leonard's cemetery letter to the library and placed it in the wooden box beneath the first letter he had sent. The box now held Margaret's love letters, my legal documents, Leonard's apologies, and one photograph of Lucy from the first dinner, because I had kept it for reasons I did not entirely admire. In the photo, she was smiling beside Leonard under the dining room chandelier, one hand resting lightly on his arm, eyes angled toward the china cabinet where Margaret's jewelry had once been displayed. I studied that photograph for a long time, not because I missed her, but because I wanted to remember how danger can enter politely. Eventually, I burned it in the fireplace. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished. It did not feel dramatic. It felt hygienic. Age did not soften me in the way people like to imagine. It clarified me. I became kinder to those who showed kindness, and less available to those who treated kindness as a resource to mine. I funded more programs anonymously than publicly. I refused 3 interviews about my donations. I turned down a plaque at the hospital and asked them to spend the money on chairs families could sleep in. I learned to say no without adding a paragraph of apology afterward. When Maria's nephew tried to flatter me into investing in a foolish restaurant concept, I told him the numbers were bad and the wine was worse. He sulked for 2 weeks, then thanked me a year later when the man who opened the restaurant went bankrupt. Boundaries, I discovered, are often mistaken for cruelty by people who benefited from your lack of them. The last time I heard Lucy's name was from Sarah Chen, who mentioned during a call that Lucy had remarried a man in commercial lending and moved to Arizona. She said it casually, as one might report weather in a city nobody planned to visit. I felt nothing at first, then a faint nausea, then nothing again. Lucy would continue being Lucy somewhere else, perhaps polished by failure, perhaps sharpened by it. She would tell her version of the story. In it, I would be unstable, vindictive, manipulated by lawyers, poisoned by grief. Leonard would be weak. Margaret would be cold. Lucy would be misunderstood. People like Lucy survive by narrating themselves as victims of consequences they earned. I no longer needed to correct her. The legal record existed. My life existed. Her version could starve without my attention. Years later, on a winter night when rain turned the terrace stones black and the valley disappeared behind fog, I opened the wooden box one last time before sealing it into the wall safe of the villa. My hands had grown older, veins raised, knuckles stiff from weather and work I had chosen rather than endured. I read Margaret's first letter to me from 1981, written during a business trip when she missed me so badly. She complained about hotel pillows for 2 pages before admitting she loved me. I read her final villa letter. I read Leonard's apologies. I read my own copy of the letter I left on the kitchen island, and it struck me as both necessary and merciless. I did not regret it. Regret would have implied another path I genuinely believed could have saved us. There had been no such path by then, only softer delays, only more payments made in dignity. Before closing the box, I added one final note of my own. Not to Leonard, not to Lucy, not even to Margaret, to whoever might someday open it after I was gone. It said, "There are inheritances made of money, and inheritances made of warning. If you receive love, do not treat it as proof that the giver cannot leave. If you receive generosity, do not confuse it with weakness. If someone grows quiet under your cruelty, do not assume they have accepted their place. They may simply be done explaining." I signed my name, Henry Holloway, not because the note needed authority, but because I wanted to recognize the man who wrote it. He was not the man who sat at the kitchen table begging for $50 he did not need. He was not the man who allowed humiliation to continue because hope had made him patient beyond reason. He was not healed, not pure, not victorious in any clean sense. He was simply no longer willing to be reduced. I placed the note in the box and locked it away. Then I walked through the dark house, turning off lights one by one. In the dining room, Margaret's portrait held the last glow from the lamp. Outside, rain moved over the vines that would wake again in spring, whether I lived to see them or not. That was the comfort and the cruelty of land. It continues. Children become strangers, wives become portraits, sons become letters, enemies become names you hear less often. Wealth becomes hospitals, scholarships, lawsuits, repairs, taxes, wages, and finally paperwork in drawers. But the land continues, indifferent and generous, asking only what you will plant before you go. I stood at the window until my reflection appeared in the glass. Older than I expected, steadier than I deserved. Somewhere across the ocean, Leonard was perhaps sleeping, perhaps awake, perhaps still apologizing to rooms that could not answer. Somewhere farther west, Lucy was perhaps smiling at a new table, inventorying a new life. And here in the stone quiet of a Tuscan night, I remained, alive inside the consequences of love, loss, cruelty, and the single decision that had saved me without making me whole. I survived, but survival was not a sunrise. It was a locked door. It was an old ring against my chest. It was rain on vines. It was the knowledge that some families end long before anyone leaves, and some departures are only the moment the truth finally catches up.